When we think of risks, most people think of really big ones. And you don't have to take really big ones, right? One of the best ways you can get better at risk taking is to take a lot of risks but smaller ones. This idea of frequent risks, still they make you feel uncomfortable, but you're taking them. And to fail small. Don't pick such a big risk that if you fail, it's going to be epic, right? Have the mindset that even small things that make you nervous or anxious or uncomfortable, those are risks. And the better you get at taking the small risks and learning how to fail small will then give you the courage to take bigger risks.
Welcome to Corporate Competitor, presented by Forbes Books, the podcast where executives share how the lessons they learned playing sports shaped their leadership. With me for today's episode is Lila Snyder, CEO of Bose. Since becoming the first woman to lead the iconic audio brand in 2020, she has shaped how the company connects with customers, bringing to life Bose's core belief that sound is power. Lila's journey began in small-town Ohio, where she grew up fixing cars and appliances with her family. She was a cheerleader for the University of Miami's national championship football team and went on to earn a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT. From consulting at McKinsey to driving change at Bose, Lila's story is rooted in problem solving, and I'm excited to learn from her today. Make sure to check out corporatecompetitorpodcast.com/notes for my favorite quotes and reflection questions to help you apply today's insights. Lila, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Don. How are you? Great to be here.
What a great day, and excited to have you. Huge fan of the work that you all do to kind of bring great sound to life for all the rest of us. So I want to start out though. You're the first woman to hold a CEO role at Bose, and you've said that a huge part of feeling equipped for the role was your early experience of learning how to be a great problem solver. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it in any job, right? It's figuring out what you're great at and really leaning on that. And so for me, that happens to be problem solving. I love solving hard problems. I feel comfortable doing that. I always have. And so as you think about entering a role like this one, being comfortable with what you're good at and what you're not good at is part of the battle. And so, I've always been a problem solver. I love it. And it made entering this job, I think, a little bit more comfortable because I was coming in as an outsider. Maybe more important than being the first woman is being the first outsider who had this job, and learning about the great history of Bose and why things were done a certain way and how we needed to change some of those things to navigate toward the future was really important. And I think that that structure and being able to kind of methodically go through the options was really important.
Where did you first start to recognize that problem solving was a superpower, if you will?
It's funny, I probably wouldn't have said that out loud, when I was young, for sure. I wouldn't have named it that. But I think, there's two parts of it for me. One is, I think the recognition that, I am happiest when I'm solving hard problems. And so I think first is just a recognition that you enjoy it, whether you're good at it or not. And I probably knew that from a pretty early age, right? Like, love to solve puzzles, love to crack challenges, I was probably the only kid who got the math homework and liked, solving the problems that were in there. And so I think the joy of it and the fun and the kind of being able to get lost in it, I probably knew that early on. I think figuring out that I was actually pretty good at it probably came later, and it probably came more outside in first. And so, I was at McKinsey for a long time, which is a feedback culture, and you get a lot of feedback. And it did allow me to hear over and over and over again. Once you hear the same feedback multiple times, you sort of start to think, okay, then maybe there's something there. And so, it was a little bit of finding joy in problem solving, which was good. And then hearing sort of consistent feedback that was in fact a strength, and then figuring out, okay, then how do you lean into that strength?
Can you maybe share a moment in your career, maybe at McKinsey, maybe today at Bose, where that methodical problem solving approach made all the difference? And maybe just a story behind that.
I learned that through my engineering education, right? Because you get to a point where everything is complicated, super complicated. The real world is really complicated. And so theories and simple formulas don't actually give you the whole answer. You have to kind of find that muscle memory of, I've seen something like that before and I applied this and it kind of worked. And so maybe I'll do that again. And that definitely came from engineering education for me. It was the see it, repeat it, see it again, that pattern recognition. And then I think the other part of it is the structure, right? So how you break something complicated into pieces that are a little bit more um, easy to absorb. And that definitely I learned at McKinsey, right? So McKinsey was great at saying, here's a big complicated thing. How do you break that into its parts and then start to tackle the parts? And once you've solved the parts, can you put it back together again? And it's really those two experiences that shape the way I think about problems.
Do you think that's innate? Do you think that's a skill that you were born or given, or do you think it's one that you had to develop?
There's there are people for whom joy is not found in problem sets and structured problem solving. And so I do think some of it is you're born with things you like doing more than others. So I think some of it is an innate, but a lot of it is learned, right? The way I approach problems has been shaped by exactly what I described, right? Being an engineer, being at McKinsey, that gave me a tool set. I think you can have an innate capability, but maybe not have any tools to bring that to life or to actually enhance it or turn it from a strength to a superpower. It's the tool sets and the things that you learn along the way that make you better at it. And I think curiosity in general makes you better at things. And so if you're doing something you like and you're curious about it, you will seek out those tools that make you even better at it. It sort of compounds itself. And so I'm sure there was some sort of innate problem solver in me from the beginning, but it's developed through curiosity and mentorship and feedback and tools that you acquire along the way for sure.
I know you made the point that being the outsider at Bose was probably more important than even the fact that you're the first woman in leadership there, in the CEO's role. What are some of the ways that you're encouraging younger women today to find some of that joy that you found?
One of the most important things I think is when we're young is when we're so impressionable when we're young. And for me, like I found this love of problem solving, even though I would have named it something different at the time, and I was encouraged to be great at it, right? And I think that is so important.
Who
Like
was
just
it that encouraged you?
oh, it was my parents for sure. And I think a little bit of growing up in it's just my sister and I. So both of us ended up being engineers. And I think, our parents took the approach that if you enjoy this and you like this and you're good at this, like lean into that, right? And that was super important for us when we were little, this idea that we could do anything we wanted. I really believe that was true. And I think it is true, right? But not all parents necessarily encourage their daughters in the same way they might encourage their sons around science and math and technology and engineering, in the same way that maybe I had that. I had teachers, and I mean, all along the way, you've got people that influence you. But I think there's this moment for young girls in particular where you have to embrace that it is cool to be good at science and math, and it's okay to differentiate yourself in that space. And I do see so many more young women coming through engineering programs, math programs. We certainly see it in the medical sciences that are, very very full of women coming through. Right, so I think we're seeing more and more young women getting that encouragement, which is awesome to see.
I know many of those that you're working with are probably engineers as well.
Yep.
But how are you encouraging to them in taking on these challenges? What are some of the ways that you're helping them and providing
Yeah.
support for them to be able to tackle big things?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think part of it is um, we're living in a pretty complicated world right now, so there's no shortage of big challenges to be solved, and I think that's true for every business, everyone. It's got a lot that that we're trying to manage, right? As the world evolves. And so I think there's no shortage of big problems. So it starts with, you know, do uh, do our teams have big problems to solve? The answer is yes. Our teams have really interesting big problems to solve. You know, we really try at Bose to make sure we're bringing folks in and retaining folks who have that curiosity. I do think that is a really important part um, of being a great leader today, is to be able to say, like, how does this work? How do I optimize our position in this particular space? And it requires you to be open to change, open to learning, and people who are inherently curious and change oriented are likely to enjoy that. And I think that's important. And I foster it probably just because I'm so interested in the problems. I ask a lot of questions. And I think, you know, as one of the ways that, you know, I certainly feel like I was mentored as I was developing my skills was not being told, but being asked, right? Did you think about this? Or how about that? Or what would happen if? And I think sort of using questioning and good listening as a tactic, that's how you learn to be a great problem solver, is you figure it out with some guidance along the way.
So I love that. So you believe that some of the best things happen here when you as leader aren't trying to solve the problem for them. You're just asking good questions. Is there something that helped you get better at asking great questions other than knowledge of the situation?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a magic formula for it. I'll come back to curiosity. I do think you're inherently better at asking questions when you care about the answer. And so, you know, being attentive to the answer is probably an important part of asking a good question. Um, and I think, you know, one of the techniques I learned really early on at McKinsey, which served me well, is, you know, do more asking and less telling. And and it was at a moment when I probably didn't have the confidence to maybe say what I thought the answer was. And so the technique was at the time more about, can you get more comfortable asking someone a question versus telling them something? And that felt more comfortable as a leadership style for me than others. And so I started this idea of asking a lot of questions. And I think you know, the more you do it, the better you get at the questions. But really, all you have to ask is why. Why do we do it that way? And then listen and say, why did it start that way? And, you know, there's sort of this, you know, I can't remember the number, but if you ask why 4 or 5 times, you sort of get to the root cause of the problem if you just sort of keep digging. And so I do think it's a little bit of persistence and a little bit of curiosity sort of gets you to the other side of it.
So I want to rewind the clock a little bit. You grow up in Toledo, Ohio, um, household where fixing cars and appliances was part of everyday life,
Yep.
right? I would assume there's probably some problem solving in that process, that some problem solving skills in that process that you were developing without even knowing, as you said, to call it that. Is there an early memory that from that time, maybe something, a moment of discovery, that a story behind something that taught you, hey, like this was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, look, I spent a lot of time in my dad's garage, a lot of time. And to say that I was doing the work is a stretch. I was the assistant, for sure. I knew every tool because I was in charge of handing them to my dad. I was very good at that. But you know, I think what the most important thing and the thing that I remember the most is um, hands-on, right? Like learning how to take things apart, how to turn a screw, how things worked. And it's just, again, like asking my dad a lot of questions, like what's that? And what is that? And why does that, you know, why is that broken? And what happened to that? And is it supposed to look like that? And, you know, just sort of learning by doing and watching, honestly. And I think that in some ways, um, you know, at that time, to be a young girl with that experience, I went into being an engineer and I wasn't afraid of that hands-on lab work, or, you know, wasn't, it was a little bit second nature for me. And so I didn't have that fear. And I think a lot of boys that I knew grew up that way, and a lot of girls I knew at my age were not doing that sort of thing. And so it just gave me a familiarity and a confidence that it's not as complicated as it might seem. And so I think it's sort of this string of memories of just constant hands-on learning and getting comfort with something that I think if you haven't had that experience can feel kind of scary.
I love that phrase you just used. It's not as complicated as it might seem, but you had to get to a place where you could see that in maybe a carburetor repair,
Yep.
and then ultimately be able to apply it into something different. But this constant belief that is something looks complicated. If I can break it down into its piece parts, I can solve it. There's that entire concept of kind of building that level of confidence around yourself. What
So
an
the
enormous
classic
gift.
story, I'll tell you a classic story of this one. So when I was in college, I had this car and the brakes were needed repaired and it was really expensive and I was very anxious about it. And I called my dad and he said, well, you can fix them. And I was like, oh, right, I could fix them. And so I went and got all the parts and I called my dad and he talked me through it. And I was in Florida in Miami and he was in Ohio and I was on the phone and I fixed my own brakes. And my friends at the time, they made so much fun of me. They're like, we cannot believe that you just fixed your brakes. And
Here's
it
the
just,
cheerleader, right? The
yeah,
cheerleader at the
exactly.
University of Miami, underneath the
Yeah.
car, oil
Yeah.
stains.
But like, what a great boost of confidence, right? I had always done it at his side and now I was on my own. And he was like, but you know how to do this. And it's true. Like you can do more than you maybe imagine because you've had those experiences. And I think sometimes it's, I talk about a lot now, this idea of taking risks and stepping out of your comfort zone. And when you do things that are uncomfortable, that's how you learn and grow. And it's just, to me, that's such a great story of like my own, coming of age, I suppose, in college of like, now you have to do these things without the training wheels of, your dad, your mentor you know, in the room with you. And now you have to kind of on your own embrace the confidence of being able to do these things. And so like, it's just a silly story. My college friends thought I was nuts. Tackling the safety portion of the vehicle was probably not the place they thought I should start. But it was I think it's a great example of taking some risk, having confidence in the skills that you've built and trying something.
One of the things we do in this podcast, we have a great listenership, many of whom are young leaders, right? Younger leaders, and they're learning from you, right? You're mentoring them right now. How do you coach someone to learn to get more comfortable with risk taking?
So I think there's two things that I would typically say. One is that when we think of risks, most people think of really big ones.
Right.
And you don't have to take really big ones, right? One of the best ways you can get better at risk taking is to take a lot of risks but smaller ones. And so, this idea of frequent risks, still they make you feel uncomfortable, but you're taking them, and to fail small, right? So don't pick such a big risk that if you fail, it's going to be epic, right? Have the mindset that even small things that make you nervous or anxious or uncomfortable, those are risks. And the better you get at taking the small risks and learning how to fail small will then give you the courage to take bigger risks. So you don't have to start by taking some epic risk. You can just do little things that are a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit, feel a little bit unsafe. I love that Jeff Bezos, if you've heard it, he's got the two-way door analogy and the one-way door analogy. And I think of risks as a little bit the same thing. And what he says is, look, we put the same amount of analysis into what he calls a two-way door, which is, if you can take a risk or make a decision, walk through the door and still walk back the other way if it doesn't work, it's actually kind of a small risk. And so you do it. And if it goes badly, you just turn around and you revert and it's okay. Versus a one-way door, which once you go through it, there's no turning back. Those are kind of your epic risks, right? You're taking, and you better be sure. But I think if you can, what I would encourage people early in their career is as often as you can. And the framework that I like to use when I was earlier in my career was at least once a week, do something uncomfortable. Ask to meet someone, ask someone for feedback, raise your hand to do something that makes you feel a little bit anxious and a little bit uncomfortable. And that means you're taking a lot of those small risks. You're getting a lot of small wins and a lot of small failures too, but you're teaching yourself how you recover from failure, and you're learning all these new skills along the way. Every week you're developing something. And the accumulation of that, even in just a year or in 2 years or in 5 years, is remarkable.
Research shows that 80% of us believe we have a book within us, but the number of people who follow through and do the work to create that book is far, far less. The reason is that the process can seem so overwhelming. And that is why I have partnered with Forbes Books to make the process easier for those of you who listen to this podcast and believe you have a story in you. So if you're ready to turn your leadership experience into your legacy, start your journey with us today at Forbes Books. Visit forbesbooks.com/Don to get started. You said in a recent interview that I had a chance to look at that a lot of the confidence you have today comes from cheerleading and learning how to stand in front of 100,000 people, right? It's a pretty epic opportunity there. Can you share a specific story from those days that you still think about today?
I remember getting to MIT and someone asked me, like, why would you waste your time doing that when you could have been doing this, scientific endeavor? And I always said, like, exactly as you said, I learned so much from that experience. I'm not inherently a massive extrovert. I was a very shy, like early, teens, 20s person. Like, I wasn't a person who put themselves out there. I don't like to be in the spotlight. I still don't love being in the spotlight. And so for me, the skills I learned as a cheerleader were, you have to put yourself out in front of people and you have to figure it out. And talk about being uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable almost all the time, every time. I loved the sport of it. I loved the team of it. I loved all of that. But the public nature of it made me very uncomfortable. And, I remember my coach at the time, who was awesome, said, "You look scared to death." And I said, "I am scared to death." And he said, "Look, that's nice, but that's not your job. Your job is to act as if this is fun. And so learn how to do that." And I'll never forget it. And there's a part of me that, as you're, taking these risks and failing small, part of it is, you gotta act a little bit like you belong there, even if you don't feel it inside. And I think you build confidence by doing that. You do it once, you do it again, you learn how. So for me, I learned how to pretend I felt comfortable until I was comfortable. And then it, sort of got easier from there. But that certainly was an eye-opening lesson for me. And I think about that a lot.
Give me an example. Give me an example of a career moment where you had to fake. What was it? Your job is to act as if this is fun. I love that line.
Act as if it's fun. Yeah. Well, look, I went to McKinsey with a PhD. I had no business experience. And, you like 3 weeks in, I was sitting in front of executives by myself and trying to help them, but without a resume that would suggest to them I had anything to add. And so, again, how do you lean on the things you are good at, right? So even in my, cheerleading example, I was a decent athlete. I was good at the sport, right? So I didn't think I was going to embarrass myself necessarily. And so I leaned on that, right? I'll lean on that and I'll learn how to have the presence that one would expect of a person in this role. And it wasn't that different when I was at McKinsey, where I knew I was a decent problem solver. I just didn't have the business resume that maybe, would have made you feel confident in that setting. So the process was somewhat the same. Lean on the things that you're good at. Don't forget about those. Gain confidence from those, and use that to actually project a level of confidence that maybe you don't feel at the very moment you're sitting there.
Wow.
It happened to me over and over again.
Yeah. But again, even in a CEO's role, right? There are times when
absolutely
A, it's great to ask questions, but B, they're expecting a presence from you, and part of it has to be you have to act like you're having fun doing this, right?
Exactly. But I think it's also important for people to understand that at any level, I'm still learning, right? So I'm still taking those risks every day and every week and trying to put myself in situations that are a little bit uncomfortable because I still want to learn and grow. And so it's also, I think, important for people to understand that, you know, the feeling you might have earlier in your career, you might assume I don't have that feeling anymore. And that's just not the case, right? Like I'm still learning, I'm still doing things that are uncomfortable, I'm still failing at some of those things. And that's okay. That's part of the process.
Can can I unravel for a second? Is there one of those risks that you've taken, small risk that where you failed, where you learned something from it? Is there something you could teach me from maybe a failed risk that you attempted that didn't quite go as planned?
In the land of failing small and often, it's hard to pick one, right? Because they're sort of happening on the regular. Um, I think the thing that I would say more so is you develop a bit of a process that says, okay, how am I going to if I know I'm going to fail, how am I going to manage through it? And I would say for me, the the pattern that developed for me over time is have the humility to admit when it's not going well. Right. I think first and foremost, confidence is great, but humility is better. Right. So once you know it's not going well, don't try to kid yourself. Like admit that this is a failure in the making and you see it, you see it. Um, and I think the second thing is making sure that you know who your safety net is to ask for help when it's going wrong. Um, and to do that quickly because failures don't age well, ever.
You know, you were on the sidelines when the Miami Hurricanes won the 1991 national championship at
Yep.
the Orange Bowl. You called it, quote, a magical time in your life.
Yep.
What do you remember about that window of time, and how did being part of such a environment, a championship winning environment, how did it influence you and play a role in even the way you think today?
It was an amazing thing to be a part of. I think I probably at the time underappreciated it. It felt so normal that we were winning and we were winning this national championship. And I think now, as I've gotten older, you appreciate just how rare that combination of events is to be in that, in that place at that time when that was happening. And I'm not sure that really registered at the time, but it was magical in a bunch of ways. I was on a team with a bunch of people I still consider my friends, and we were having a lot of fun. We traveled around all over to amazing campuses and different bowl games, and we had an opportunity to kind of see the world a little bit, which was great. And we got to watch up close a team achieve something incredible. And I think what you learn from that, my husband happened to be on that team, so I maybe got a different viewpoint of it then and now, but it you get a vantage point into what excellence looks like. And I think that most people it's easy to watch excellence at the end. And I think if you've watched the whole process, right? The 100-degree days with, practice outside, the grittiness in the off season, the amount of work it took, how much all of those players gave up to put their whole selves into being a part of that team, the grit, the team dynamic, the winning. Like when you see it play out over a period of years or months, and you see not just the outcome, but the hard work and the pain and the effort that goes into it, I just think it's an amazing thing to see.
What is there something you've applied from those lessons that as CEO you're leaning into?
It's funny because as you asked the question, I probably wouldn't have thought of it that way, but I'll tell you a couple that I think are similar. um, one I think is assembly of the team, like the chemistry of the team, the skill sets of the team. There's a magic to creating a winning team. And, I think that 1991 championship team was a magical team. And it's not just because of the individual football skills they brought, which was a part of it, but it was how that team was brought together, the trust, how they worked together, um, how they held each other accountable, how they gave each other honest feedback and, a little bit of tough love. Like that part of building a team, I think is a big part of what I consider to be my role, is making sure I'm bringing a team that's got all the right diverse skills to address the problems right in front of us and the ones that we maybe can't see yet. But then more importantly, making sure that team is coming together to make the most of the skills that they're bringing. And that's the combination of trust and teamwork and, you know, um, and honesty and all of those things that build a winning team. So I think that's definitely one that I would bring. The other one I would say, and the words I use at Bose is, we can't take our foot off the gas. But the way I think about that is championships are won in the off season. And I saw that at the University of Miami, right? I saw the work that went in February and March and April and it wasn't just, in the season or right now, and then we can relax a little bit. Like, to really consistently win at a high level, you have to keep your foot on the gas, and you can't have those letdown moments where you say, we're going to take it easy for a little while. And I think that that pace and that consistency of effort, I would say, is definitely a lesson I bring into this world too.
You've talked about mentors and sponsors. I love
Yeah.
you've used that word, sponsors, pushing you into opportunities that felt daunting.
Yeah.
Um, can you share one specific moment where someone in your career journey here believed in you before you believed in yourself and actually pushed you out onto a limb? Set the scene for us, if you would.
Yeah, I think sponsors are so important, right? I describe, mentors are great and important, but sponsors are the people who stick their neck out for you and they create opportunities for you. Um, and often it is before you think you're ready, but they've seen something and they believe that you can do it. It happened to me all the time. All the time. And I think McKinsey is probably a great environment for that because you're progressing fast and you're kind of always getting pushed into things. But I can remember, the first team that I managed, I did not think I was ready. I wanted to kind of take it a little easier for a little bit longer and make sure I knew what I was doing. And I just remember a partner saying, nope, like, I don't want you to be an associate on this team. I want you to manage this team. And I can remember, like,
How deep into your career is this?
2 years into McKinsey,
Two
not
years
quite
in.
2 years. Yeah.
Wow.
So 2 years, 2 years prior, I was sitting in a lab doing research at MIT, and then I was going to manage this team and manage the client. And that role at McKinsey is so important because you're managing the internal team, but you're kind of the hub between all the clients and the team. And it was the most fun job I've
But
ever
you're
had.
also 20. You're also 25 and
Yeah.
trying to sit in a room with both executives on the
Yeah.
client side and probably people much older than you on your
Yeah.
side.
Always. And I just remember thinking I thought I had no idea what I was doing, and I probably maybe didn't. But again, I think it's just this notion of someone has put me here because they feel like I'm ready. And so I'm going to take confidence from that and do my best and, kind of use that lifeline of help when I need it. And I muddled through it. I wouldn't say I was a great manager, but I muddled through it and I learned a bunch, and I wouldn't have been any better at it if it had been 6 months later. And I think that's the realization. I wouldn't have been any more prepared.
So one question we've asked a lot this year is about employee retention. There's a lot of research out there today. Many leaders are this is a real challenge for a lot of leaders. Turnover, people switching jobs more freely than ever. What are some of the ways you as leader are finding most effective in helping keep your team engaged and maybe reducing that churn?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down, I think, to a couple things. One is people need to be working on things they find interesting. So, first and foremost, I think it's important that we're doing work that is valuable and impactful. And one of the things that's great about Bose, I think, just because of our size, is that it's really easy, I think, here for employees to see the impact that they're having on the company, right? When you get into a company that's really, really large, I think that's one of the challenges is to help every employee find in their everyday work the impact that it's having on the success of the overall company. And I think we try to help every one of our employees make sure they're doing interesting work and they can see its direct correlation to our strategy, et cetera. So I think it starts with that. If your individual role is not inspiring in some way and you're not doing interesting work, it doesn't matter how many free lunches you put around it, right? So it has to
How many
start.
foosball machines do you have in the
Yeah,
in the in the playroom? Yeah.
yeah, it has to start, I think, with that. Then the second thing I think is just learning and development, right? People want to be learning and developing in their career. And so part of that comes from a fulfilling role that is evolving and bringing on more of these new challenges that we've been talking about. But I think, you know, someone is more likely to stay if they feel like they're learning and growing in their role and with, the programs that we may put around that as well. And then finally, I think the culture of the company, the values of the company, the culture has to feel like it matches their own, right? I think every company is different and not everyone is the same. And so you've got to work for a company where you feel like you fit in and that you belong and that that the culture and the values of the place feel like um, natural to you, I think. And so if you can kind of get those three things right, I think in general, most people will stay. And as I say, like, and not everyone should stay, right? We can't always provide the right next opportunity for someone. And when I see someone leave Bose and go somewhere else for a great opportunity that we can't offer them here, I'm excited for them, right? And I hope that as part of their development journey, they have learned something here and they have grown as a professional and they go on to their next stop, bringing kind of that goodness with them. And that I think feels good, right? Part of what we want to
Mhm.
do is obviously retain our best talent, but when we see them leave, we also want them to go be great ambassadors of Bose in other places. And I'm excited when people find those successes too.
Lila, as I said, I am a huge fan of your products, a
Thank you.
huge fan of the company, and today I'm an even greater fan of yours. And
Thank you so much.
won't ever root for the Miami Hurricanes, but I will root for you.
I appreciate
And,
that.
and today, I thank you for being a corporate competitor with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, that was so much fun. And the next time I put on my Bose headphones, I will think about this interview over and over again. Um, some great takeaways, and actually more than I normally do give you, but there was so much to this conversation. Number one, her passion for problem solving, right? I love that line. She said, I was always happiest when I was solving problems, whether it was puzzles or even math homework. I don't recognize that, but good for her. And it obviously was a skill set she was able to deliver on as she's grown into her career. Curiosity, she said, was always important to her, and then always seeking feedback. I loved her line where she said, to be successful in problem solving, you have to do more asking and less telling. Ask the question why often, then shut up and listen, right? Just listen, because you're going to learn something every time you ask the question why. And she talked about how that started in her dad's garage, where he encouraged her to ask questions and not just hand him tools, but to learn in the entire process. And that takes us to the second great takeaway I had, which was her discussions around risk taking. Unbelievably good content there, because she talked about taking at least one really good risk per week, and it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be epic, but it's something that makes you uncomfortable. And that willingness to do that allows her to build up kind of a risk taking muscle, if you will, which makes her better as time goes on. Third, I loved it when she talked about her college cheerleading coach looking at her, recognizing that she didn't look like she was comfortable, and she acknowledged that she wasn't. And his quote was, "Your job is to act as if this is fun," right? But that helped her learn how to be confident in rooms that she didn't feel quite equipped to be in at different stages of her career, and how valuable that is. And so, cheerleading really helped her with that, and in that learned her confidence is great. But I loved her line. She said, "Confidence is great, but humility is better." So if you make a mistake, know who your safety net is, who will help you understand how to manage your way back out of those situations. Her great line: "Failure doesn't age well." I love that. In my fourth takeaway was when I asked her about what she learned about around being that national championship team, being around those Miami Hurricanes in '91, and she talked about the importance of chemistry and the assembly of a team and what it takes to put people together who will hold each other accountable. And then she talked about the second piece, which was you can't take your foot off the gas. Championships are won, in her opinion, in the off season. So don't take any time down when you're trying to think through, how do I get better? It's a constantly generating model there. And then the last of my five takeaways, I've never done five, I don't believe, is that she talked about sponsors, not just mentors. We talk a lot about mentors on this program and elsewhere. What does it mean to have a mentor? She talked about the importance of having sponsors, which are people who will push you out on a limb, create opportunities for you before you even believe you're ready. And, she told the story of being asked at McKinsey to manage a client team 2 years into her career. She's 25, and she's having to manage both the client and her team, all of whom were all older than her. But she had to believe she was worthy because they gave her the chance. But then she never strayed too far, she said, from the lifeline that was provided her by her sponsor. So, powerful lessons, one after another from Lila today. I'm better for having had this conversation. I hope you're better for having heard it. I appreciate you. Although I waited the whole time to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and do that.